Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our shiur on kashering plastic utensils, for Pesach or for all year long. The rules are basically the same. If you're kashering for Pesach, or if a utensil has become not kosher for some reason, you want to kasher it, the rules are basically the same. So what we're talking about is kashering plastic utensils for Pesach. Now, normally, a good place to begin would be the Shulchan Aruch, or to go back to the primary sources in the Mishnah and Gemara and proceed from there. But plastics are a new thing. They didn't have plastics in antiquity and Middle Age. It's all just began for all practical purposes around 100 years ago in the 20th century, and therefore we don't have sources in the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch that talk about this. So we're going to have to go right to the Acharonim. We're going to have to go right to the modern poskim, who are, of course, the first to deal with this issue. Let's begin with the Igros Moshe, with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Get him on the screen. Voila. Now, we're going to see that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is very strict on this matter. He needs no introduction, I'm sure. He was the greatest of the Rabbanim in North America in the 20th century. He's very strict on this matter and does not approve of any Haggalah at all. We're about to see his words, and we'll understand why. Then we're going to proceed to the great poskim of Eretz Yisrael, and we're going to see that they are more lenient and indeed permit kashering of plastic. And you might initially think that the difference between them has to do with the affluence of the Jewish society in America. Well, a plastic utensil is kosher. You want to use a plastic utensil from all year long for Pesach. Well, just buy a new one. What's the problem? Whereas in Eretz Yisrael, back in the 1950s, 1960s, when these problems first arose, plastic utensils, the Jews in Eretz Yisrael were living in relative poverty, and requiring them to buy new utensils with a major expense in those days. You might think that the difference between the strict poskim in North America and the lenient poskim in Israel has to do with the socioeconomic background of the two communities. But as we look at the sources, I think you'll be convinced that, in fact, the difference between them, the machlokas, has nothing to do with socioeconomic differences between the affluent society in North America and the relatively impoverished society in Eretz Yisrael in those days. Let's take a look first at the strict opinion of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Now, the text we have on the screen is taken from his Tshuvot. All the texts we're going to look at are taken from the primary sources. I'm not going to bother to mention exactly where I took the sources from, because you have the sources exactly on the screen, or down to the paragraph number. And if you want to check and see what typographical errors I made, because I'm not a great typist, feel free to check. But these texts are as accurate as I could make them while typing quickly. The first tshuva we're going to look at was written in 1969. That's going to become important later when we look at the dates of other tshuvas. So just keep in mind that this initial opinion we're looking at by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is from the year 1969. Let's see his words. And his approach is fairly simple and straightforward. Bidvar kli me'rober. Regarding a utensil made out of rubber. Rubber, that's some kind of ancient Hebrew word, I suppose. And the question arises, im mahani hagala. Can you do hagala on a rubber utensil which has become treif? Or can you do hagala on a rubber utensil in order to be able to use it for Pesach. Now, the rubber turns out to be a topic of great discussion amongst the modern poskim, but the discussions usually do not focus on kashrus. The discussions of rubber among the modern poskim usually revolve around the question of tumah v'tahara, ritual impurity. For example, can you, if you have a drain in the bottom of a mikveh, a hole for a drain hole, can you plug up the hole with a rubber stopper in a mikveh? Is that something which is mekabel tumah, subject to the rules of ritual impurity or not? It's in the context of ritual purity and impurity that rubber is usually discussed. But of course, kitchen utensils can be made partially out of rubber or entirely out of rubber. Of course, it's possible. It happens. It's true. And the question arises whether you can do hagala, that is kashering them by boiling. An immersion in boiling water is the normal way of kashering things. Can you do the normal hagala, the normal immersion of the utensil in boiling water in order to make it fit for Pesach or kosher if it became treif? Well, his answer, that's the question. Now comes his answer. Hine, behold, harubber shehu me'etz. There are two kinds of rubber on the market. One kind of rubber comes from the rubber tree. In Southeast Asia, they grow rubber trees. Well, you might even have one in your garden, in your backyard. Some rubber out there comes from the rubber tree. And if your utensil was made out of rubber that came from a rubber tree, mahani hagala, it's fine to do hagala. It's fine to kasher it, no problem at all. After all, the Chazal in the Mishnah and Gemara and the Rishonim, the great medieval authorities, and of course, following them, the Acharonim, the modern authorities, are all agreed. They're all agreed that kli eitz, a utensil made out of wood, a wooden spoon to stir the soup while you're cooking. Everyone agrees that a wooden utensil can be kashered by immersion in boiling water. And if the rubber was made from a rubber tree, it has the status of kli eitz. It has the status of being a wooden utensil. It's not literally wood, but in concept, it's the same thing. It came from from a tree, and therefore can be kashered by immersion in boiling water. That's if it's natural rubber from a rubber tree. Va'af im yesh safek mitzad sheyesh sham gam eza chomer kimi, and even if there's some safek, some doubt about the composition of the rubber, after all, your rubber kitchen mat or whatever it is that you want to kasher probably has ingredients. The composition of the rubber probably includes some other chemicals besides or in addition to what came from the tree. That could be. But safek d'Rabbanan, d'havi l'kula, that would only be a doubt of rabbinic status, and we can be lenient on that. Bottom line, natural rubber from a rubber tree made into a utensil, which became treif or chametz stick, can be kashered by immersion in boiling water. No problem at all. Aval, that little word, which tells us we're about to encounter a big problem. Aval, yesh rubber she'eino me'etz. There are also rubber products which are not made from rubber from a tree. They're made from synthetic rubber. There are two kinds of rubber on the market. Natural rubber, coming from a rubber tree, and synthetic rubber, which is, originally synthesized in a laboratory, now made in humongous quantities in factories. Just as a passing note, as far as the two kinds of rubber are concerned, the higher quality rubber is the rubber which comes from a rubber tree. This synthetic rubber tends not to be of such high quality. Surgical gloves, high quality surgical gloves are made from rubber, which comes entirely from a rubber tree. Well, back in the days when they were using rubber for surgical gloves. Automobile tires, the better quality automobile tires have a higher ratio of natural rubber in them and a lower ratio of synthetic rubber. The cheaper tires are the other way around. They have more synthetic rubber in them and less natural rubber. But there are two kinds of rubber. You can synthesize an imitation rubber in the laboratory or in a factory. And if we're talking about the synthetic imitation of rubber, and you make a utensil out of it, Ella, the synthetic rubber is made entirely out of chemicals that get mixed together in the factory. Hu davar chadash, that's something new. Unlike from a rubber tree, which is a natural product that has been around since the creation of the world, unlike the natural rubber, which has been around forever, synthetic rubber is a modern invention which they didn't have in antiquity. Lo nimtza b'divrei kadmonim. So of course, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, of course, none of the earlier sources discuss synthetic rubber. If you have a question about natural rubber, the answer will be, oh, it's just like wood that comes from a tree. But if you have a question about synthetic rubber, who knows? The great rabbis never discussed it in the Mishnah and Gemara. The Rambam never talked about it. It's a new thing, only recently invented. And since they never mentioned synthetic rubber because it didn't exist yet, we have no way of knowing what they would have said about it. Maybe they would have said, it can never be kashered. Maybe they would have said, kashered like natural rubber. Who knows what they would have said? They were silent on the issue because it had not yet been invented. Ein lahatir lahagilam. Therefore, we cannot permit kashering of synthetic rubber utensils. Bottom line, Igros Moshe has taught us a fundamental principle. The laws of Haggalah, the laws of kashering utensils, are given to us in the Mishnah and Gemara and discussed by the great Rishonim, the medieval authorities, and we have Piskei Din, bottom line decisions in the Shulchan Aruch, and that guides us in determining what can and what cannot be kashered. But things they never spoke about because they had not yet been invented, we have no way of knowing what they would have said, and therefore, hands off, we could not permit kashering them. Now, it's perfectly clear, is it not, that this reasoning applies not only to synthetic rubber, but to any other synthetic compound, polymers, plastics, by any other name. Polymers are all recent inventions. They did not have any kind of plastic utensils in the good old days. I'm even old enough to remember when we didn't have them in the kitchen. We had only, glass and crockery, and well, I'm old enough to remember when plastic utensils first invaded our modern kitchens, not so long ago. But plastic, being a polymer product, resulting only from modern research and modern technology, of course, did not exist in earlier periods. And who knows what they would have said. And therefore, we cannot allow kashering any modern material. Modern material means a material which didn't exist in earlier days that they spoke about. Now, this, of course, has broad implication, not only regarding rubber, but all manner of plastics, but plenty of other synthetic fibers, plenty of other synthetic materials which have been developed in modern times. None of it can be kashered according to the Igros Moshe, according to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. That's a very strict position. And not surprisingly, his position called forth some opposition. Before we look at the opposition, the other opinion, the more lenient opinion, those who oppose the Igros Moshe, before we look at that, let me make a little footnote. The Torah speaks only about 5 kinds of metal: silver, gold, iron, lead, and copper. When they said copper, they probably meant bronze. It wasn't so pure. And those are the 5 kinds of metal which are mentioned in the Torah. And the Torah says that these 5 metals are all makabel tumah, are all subject to the rules of ritual impurity. Oh. Now, of course, nowadays, that's not very important for us, because nowadays we do not have Kohanim working in the Beis HaMikdash, offering the sacrifices which have to be done in ritual purity. And therefore, what is and what is not subject to the laws of ritual impurity is largely of theoretical interest. But there's sometimes, there are a few halachas where it becomes terribly important for us today to know what is and what is not subject to the laws of ritual impurity. For example, a Kohen is not allowed to be under the same roof with a cadaver, with a dead human body. Everyone's probably familiar with this. But what constitutes a chatzitza? What constitutes a valid interruption between the Kohen and the cadaver? If the Kohen is sitting in the passenger compartment of an airplane and the cadaver is downstairs in the baggage compartment, does the floor of the passenger compartment, which is the ceiling of the baggage compartment, does that constitute a valid interruption which blocks the ritual impurity of the cadaver rising into the passenger compartment and contaminating the Kohen? That's an important question for Kohanim to answer. And in order to answer this question, we have to know what materials are and are not subject to the laws of ritual impurity. Rav Moshe Feinstein, walking in the footsteps of the Gra, the Gaon Mevilna, the great early 18th century authority, points out that the Torah could have said all metal is subject to the laws of impurity. If the Torah had said that, then we would know that modern metals like aluminum, magnesium, modern metals which were unknown in biblical days are also subject to the laws of impurity. But the Torah never said that all metal is subject to the laws of ritual impurity. The Torah only said the 5 metals which I listed earlier. Now, of course, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the Torah, he knew that these other metals existed in nature, but no one knew about them back in biblical days. It follows, according to the Gaon Mevilna and Rav Moshe Feinstein, who walks in his footsteps on this issue, that metals which were discovered in modern times, including aluminum and magnesium, are not subject to the laws of ritual impurity. And since the airplanes today, designing an airplane is a trade-off between strength of the fuselage and weight. You want minimal weight and maximum strength. And that creates an engineering problem. So the engineers have designed an aluminum magnesium alloy, which is sufficiently strong and light enough to do the job. The airplane is basically made out of material which is not makabel tumah, not subject to the laws of ritual impurity. And that has great implications for Kohanim, for example. Well, my point in this footnote is that Rav Moshe Feinstein is very consistent in his approach, things which they did not know about in those days, either because they had not yet been invented or not yet discovered, things they didn't know about in those days, do not fall under the rubric of the things that they permitted or prohibited. We don't know whether they would have permitted or prohibited it, and that has great implications in many areas, specifically kashering synthetic materials for Pesach. No, 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 you can't do it, according to the Hebrew Church. And not surprisingly, many rabbis in North America, not only in North America, but especially in North America, many rabbis are disciples, many community rabbis are disciples of Rabbi Dovid Fink, and of course they instruct their flocks as they had learned from their great master, the Igros Moshe Rabbi Dovid Fink, when it comes to Pesach or all year long. A plastic utensil or any synthetic material which has become tray for chametz stick cannot be kashered. That's not surprising. Now, that's the end of the footnote. Let's now turn to the opposition to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. The opposition begins in a sefer called Yesod Yeshurim, which was written by Rav Gedalia Felder. Rav Gedalia Felder was originally from Eastern Europe, and he was a Rav in Toronto, Canada. He survived the Holocaust and ended up in Toronto, Canada, and he was one of the heavyweights. He was a very weighty posek in the 20th century, and these are his words. Pella, it's surprising. Madua lo yehe dino keklei glalim. It's surprising that Rav Moshe Feinstein is strict on this matter and does not permit kashering plastic utensils. Why should plastic utensils be different than clay glalim? What on earth are clay glalim? Well, I have to tell the truth. If you find it distasteful, just ignore it. Clay glalim are kitchen utensils made out of dung. The glalim, it means dung. Back in those days, they used animal dung to mold into, you mix the dung with a little bit of earth, a little bit of dirt, mold it into the shape of a utensil, and there you got yourself a utensil made out of animal dung, clay glalim. Why is this interesting? Why are dung utensils interesting? Well, rather like clay adamah, rather like utensils made out of the earth, earthenware. The Lerova poskim hanilu hagala, according to most poskim, through the centuries. These are not modern things. These are things from the old days. The dung utensils. I hope no one's using them today, but in olden days, people were using them, and they're discussed by the poskim. And yes, you can kasher them by immersion in boiling water. Now, of course, dung utensils happen to be mentioned nowhere in Talmudic sources. That's not precisely true. Dung utensils are mentioned in Mishnah and Talmud, but only in connection with the rules of ritual impurity. Chazal in the Mishnah and Gemara never mention dung utensils in connection with Hagala, kashering them by immersion in boiling water. And even though the Mishnah and Gemara never talks about it, through the centuries, back in those days when they were using these utensils, rabbis permitted kashering them by immersion in boiling water. Well, you see, through the centuries, rabbis never thought that it was essential to have a Talmudic discussion of something in order to reach a conclusion. Therefore, it's Pella, surprising that Rav Moshe Feinstein rejects any leniency where there's absence of proof from the Mishnah and Gemara. Well, bottom line, the Sodi Yeshurun, written by Rav Gedalia Felder, is disagreeing with the Igros Moshe. And just as the rabbis in Middle Ages and late antiquity permitted kashering dung utensils, even though it's not discussed anywhere in the Gemara, nowhere in the Mishnah, we should equally permit kashering modern materials made out of synthetics. That's one objection to the Igros Moshe's strict opinion. Next, I'm quoting from the Nitei Gavriel, which is a very, very popular and very, very influential work. I see it on the shelf. It's all shelf full of books. I see it on the shelf in virtually every synagogue that I've visited over the last few years. It's an important and influential work. He says, these are his words, Yesod Divrei HaIgros Moshe, the foundations upon which Rav Moshe Feinstein built his strict opinion, tzarich and require careful thought. Minale, where did he get this idea from? Where did he get the idea from that you can't reach a halachic conclusion in the absence of a discussion in the Mishnah and Gemara? Where did he get this idea from? Hare, behold, Mivor b'Magen Avram. The Magen Avram says, Magen Avram. The Magen Avram, 17th century Poland, the Magen Avram, the single most important commentary on the Shulchan Aruch ever written, 17th century Poland. The Magen Avram says, Klei Adama, earthenware, can be kashered by immersion in boiling water. And the Machtis HaShekel, the primary commentary on the Magen Avram, Machtis HaShekel is a commentary on the Magen Avram, which is in turn a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. In the business that they call the Machtis HaShekel, a super commentary. It's a commentary on a commentary. The Machtis HaShekel says, Lo Nimtza B'Rishonim, points out that the Gemara, the Mishnah doesn't discuss earthenware. The Gemara does not discuss earthenware. The Rishonim, the medieval authorities, do not discuss earthenware. That didn't stop the Magen Avram, the most important commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the most influential commentary on the Shulchan Aruch ever, didn't stop him from reaching a conclusion that you can kasher earthenware utensils by immersing in boiling water. That's whether they became treif for use all year long, or they were used for chametz and you want to use them for Pessah. Afilu hachi. Nonetheless, svira le Magen Avram. Nonetheless, the Magen Avram holds, and not only the Magen Avram, also the Shulchan Aruch Harav, also the Shulchan Aruch, there are two Shulchan Aruchs. There's well, I don't know which is the more famous one. It depends what circles you come from. The one Shulchan Aruch was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo in the beginning of the 16th century. That's the Shulchan Aruch we've been talking about up till this point. But there's another book with exactly the same name, the Shulchan Aruch, and in rabbinic literature, the second one is called the Shulchan Aruch Harav, so you know which one we're talking about. The Shulchan Aruch Harav was written by the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. The first Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Baal Tanya, in addition to having been a great Hasidic leader, in addition to having been one of the great Hasidic masters, the Baal Tanya, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, was also one of the most influential poskim of the 18th century. Indeed, the Mishnah Berurah, for example, quotes and relies upon the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Shulchan Aruch of the Baal Tanya, on virtually every page. He's quoted and relied upon, immensely influential, but he too, just like the Magen Avram, has no difficulty in approving of kashering earthenware utensils by immersion in boiling water, even in the absence of any sources in the Mishnah, the Gemara, or the Rishonim, the medieval authorities. Indeed, as far as we know, all the poskim agree that you can kasher earthenware by immersion in boiling water. So it follows that there should be no objection to kashering plastics, synthetic rubber, for any new material. By new material, I mean either a material which is only recently discovered or recently invented and therefore never discussed before. Should be no objection at all to kashering plastic utensils. Let's go one step further. Vayeshev Moshe, the sefer we're about to quote from, written by Rav Moshe Zarger, he's one of the rabbis of the Eda Haredit here in Yerushalayim, in Mea She'arim neighborhood. If you're familiar with the rabbinic bodies in Eretz Yisrael, then you know that the Eda Haredit, represented here by one of their chief rabbis, Rav Moshe Zarger, is the pinnacle of strictness in the world of kashrus. There's no one out there who is stricter than the rabbis of the Eda Haredit in Mea She'arim today. And here we're going to have their position represented by one of their rabbis, Rabbi Moshe Zarger. Let's see what he has to say. Be'igros Moshe, in the Igros Moshe, well, we started today, that's the first screen we saw today. He wrote, Kol davar chadash, shena'aseh mita'arovet minim chimiyim, any new material which is made out of some composition of chemicals, some chemists invented it. Any new material invented only by recent chemists, which of course the earlier poskim never discussed because it hadn't been invented yet. He says you can't do hagala on them. I don't know where the Igros Moshe got this idea from. Well, Gzerot Hadashot, it's like the Igros Moshe is legislating some new prohibition which he made up in his own mind. We do not have the authority to legislate new laws just because we think this, just because we think that. The Sanhedrin, back in the days of the Beis HaMikdash, when the Beis HaMikdash was standing, the Sanhedrin, which sat in the Beis HaMikdash, they had the authority to legislate new laws, and what we call rabbinic law, d'Rabbanan, anything which is d'Rabbanan, was legislated by the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was both a judicial body and a legislative body. Now, L'havdil, rather like the House of Lords in Britain, which sits as a legislative body but can also sit as a judicial body. In any event, after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the Sanhedrin ceased to exist. Exactly what year that happened is something that historians argue about, but shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Sanhedrin ceased to exist, and we'll let historians argue about exactly what year that the cessation of the Sanhedrin occurred. But since then, since shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple, we are not authorized to legislate new laws, and it seems like Rav Moshe Feinstein has tried to do that. Hare kli adama gam kein lo nimsa b'rishonim. Earthenware utensils are not discussed by the rabbis of the Sanhedrin back in those days, and therefore not discussed by the medieval authorities either. Nonetheless, the Magen Avram and a lot of other poskim following him think it's obvious that you can kasher earthenware utensils by immersion in boiling water. Well, Rav Moshe Feinstein seems to be flying in the face of a long-standing tradition among the rabbis to permit hagala, kashering by immersion in boiling water of materials, even in the absence of any discussion in the Mishnah Gemara or earlier sources. Gam b'kli porcelain, shehechmiru ha'acharonim, porcelain utensils, which acharonim in general, modern poskim in general hold you cannot kasher porcelain. That's a subject which deserves a separate shiur by itself, but most poskim hold that you cannot kasher porcelain. And when the poskim are discussing why you cannot kasher porcelain, they have many reasons for this, but they never mention the reason you can't kasher it because it didn't exist in antiquity. If such an argument were valid, we cannot kasher anything which did not exist in antiquity because they didn't discuss it earlier. If that argument were valid, that should be one of the reasons why we cannot kasher porcelain. Although the rabbis do indeed say you cannot kasher porcelain, they have other reasons for it. Well, why didn't they add this reason? They didn't add this reason because it's not a valid reason. Rav Moshe Feinstein is wrong in the opinion of Rav Zager. Kama achronim esfirli d'shia kayadua. Some poskim, there are poskim who hold that the porcelain can be kosher. That's a controversial matter, which we're not going to get into today. Well, I could go on and on and on and on. I think you've got the basic melody here. Rav Moshe Feinstein has a problematic opinion. His strictness in blocking the kashering of synthetic fibers is a very problematic position that, well, we've had screen after screen, and I could add many more, but there's a limit to how many times you have to see the same idea repeated over and over again by different rabbis. Many rabbis find Rav Moshe Feinstein's position here highly problematic and indeed permit kashering synthetic materials by immersion in boiling water. No problem at all. Now, the problematic nature of Rav Moshe's position becomes even more troublesome in another tshuva. Remember the date of the original tshuva in which he blocked kashering synthetic materials? That was in the late 1960s. Here's another tshuva, also written by the hand of Rav Moshe Feinstein, the saying Rav Moshe Feinstein, just a few years later in 1973. Let's see what he said. This is 4 years after the previous tshuva when he was strict. 4 years later, he writes as follows: Be'inyan kelim shel matachot hamitzupim beporcelain, regarding metal utensils which are coated with porcelain, which is a very common form of kitchen utensils. Well, nowadays it's not so popular, but when I was growing up, just about everyone used metal utensils, pots, pans, baking trays. People used metal utensils, and the metal was coated with porcelain. That was they still on the market today, but they used to be standard. And these utensils, porcelain, which is a coating over a metal base, ein mo'il lehem hagala, you cannot kasher them by immersion in boiling water, im ne'esru, if they became prohibited, either because of the chametz, you want to use it on Pesach, or treif, and it's a problem for all year long. Porcelain utensils cannot be kashered. Why not? To call porcelain hu davar haboleya ve'en yotzei midafanav la'olam. Porcelain absorbs taste, chametz or treif, whatever gets cooked in the porcelain pot or baked in the porcelain oven tray. It absorbs tastes, but never releases taste. Hagala, immersion in boiling water, is a process which releases absorbed tastes, and Hagala doesn't work on porcelain. Why not? Come on, kashered. Because porcelain, in its composition, the composition of porcelain is the same as the composition of kashered, is the same as the composition of clay utensils. And there, the Mishnah and Gemara say, clay utensils, kashered, absorb taste, but never release it. Similarly, porcelain absorbs taste and never releases it, and therefore you cannot kasher it. Kain paske rova acharonim. That's what most poskim hold. The Loka Hacham Tzvi. There was one of the great poskim, namely the Hacham Tzvi, Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi was the great rabbi of the Sfaradim in Amsterdam in the late 17th, early 18th century. He himself was not Sfaradi, he himself was Ashkenazi. That's why his name, Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi. But when the Jews fled or were kicked out of the Iberian Peninsula, out of Spain, and 6 years later out of Portugal, of course, they ended up all kinds of places throughout the Mediterranean basin primarily, but they also ended up in, there were Sephardic communities which were established in Hamburg, in Amsterdam, in London, plenty of places, still have today, Sephardic. And he was the Rav of the Sfaradim in Amsterdam, and an immensely influential Rav. He has a das yochid. He had a maverick opinion according to which porcelain utensils could be kashered, but all the others are strict on that matter. Hametzupim porcelain hurakzipu idak. It's metal utensils which have a porcelain coating on them. The porcelain coating is very thick. Most of the thickness of the utensil is metal, and maybe Chacham Tzvi would agree that modern porcelain absorbs and cannot release taste. Who knows? But Chacham Tzvi is a small minority, lenient opinion regarding porcelain. Now you're wondering why porcelain is so interesting. Well, it is interesting, but the reason porcelain is interesting for our discussion is kelim shel Teflon plastic. What about utensils which are coated with Teflon? Now Teflon is a fluorocarbon compound, which is modern, didn't exist until the 1960s. Teflon was originally developed as an insulator, for re-entry of space vehicles, for re-entry into the atmosphere. The space vehicle heats up because of friction with the atmosphere as it re-enters, and you need some heavy-duty insulation to keep the machinery or the people inside the vehicle, to keep them at a reasonable temperature. And Teflon was the original insulator, which was designed for that purpose. It's a wonderful insulator. It doesn't allow heat to go through very well at all. The problem, which the engineers discovered very quickly with Teflon, is that not only does it block a transfer of heat brilliantly, but another problem with it is nothing sticks to it, and therefore they couldn't get it to stick to the space vehicles. They just fall off. They couldn't get it to stick, and therefore it turns out to be useless for re-entry of space vehicles. On the other hand, a very thin layer, very, very thin, so enough heat will get through, and you can use your frying pan. If there'll be a thicker layer of Teflon, the heat just wouldn't get through, and you couldn't use the frying pan. A very thin layer of Teflon can more or less be adhered to a metal base. But the truth is, if you use Teflon, it also flakes off. It doesn't stick so well. After a while, it's going to stop sticking. What about a Teflon frying pan? Can Teflon be kashered? Now, the answer to this should be obvious, simple, and straightforward. Since Rabbi Moshe Feinstein taught us at the beginning of today's lesson that new materials that did not exist in earlier days, we cannot allow them to be kashered because they never discussed them earlier. We don't know what they would have said, the earlier rabbis. The conclusion should be simple, straightforward, and obvious. Teflon is a new material. Who knows what the rabbis of the Mishnah or Gemara would have said? Who knows what the Rambam or the Shulchan Aruch would have said if they had encountered Teflon? We simply don't know, and therefore the obvious and straightforward conclusion would be that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein should block the Kashering of Teflon utensils. But he says the opposite. Mo'il hagala berodchim. You can immerse Teflon utensils in boiling water in order to kasher them, whether it's a question of treif to kosher or chametz to Pessah, doesn't matter. Yes, Teflon frying pans can be kashered by immersion in boiling water. Well, Rav Moshe Feinstein seems to have contradicted himself and rejected his own principle. Not only do a long list of rabbis find the strict position highly problematic and therefore don't follow it, but 4 years later, Rav Moshe Feinstein himself apparently found the strict position untenable and abandoned it himself. Bottom line, we're left with strong evidence. Bottom line, we're left with strong indications and proof that the kashering of synthetic materials, whether it's synthetic rubber, synthetic Teflon, plastic polymers by any other name, silicone, silicon, whether you, in Hebrew, silicon and silicone, one word is duty for both silicon and silicone in Hebrew, which creates immense confusion when you're speaking in Hebrew. Silicon is an element on the periodic table, unlike silicone, which is indeed a synthetic polymer. Yeah, silicon is definitely a synthetic polymer, and therefore falls into exactly this discussion. According to the initial tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, cannot be kashered. According to all the other rabbis, and apparently Rav Moshe himself changed his mind. It can indeed be kashered. As far as Pyrex is concerned, that's a whole different can of worms. Let me just let's cancel that expression, can of worms. Glass cannot be a can. Cans are made of metal. The issue with Pyrex is as follows. Pyrex is a kind of glass. Glass on the molecular level has an amorphous structure. That's a complicated way of saying that on the molecular level, glass is not a crystal. Unlike metal, where all the molecules are arrayed in a very rigorous crystal lattice, unlike metals, which are on the molecular level are crystals, as the molecules are ordered in a very orderly fashion, arrayed in a lattice. Unlike metals, unlike crystals, glass is amorphous. The molecules just jumble together every which way on the molecular level, no particular order, no particular structure to them at all, which is the primary reason that glass cannot be melted. Metals melt. That is, as you heat up the metal, you'll reach the melting point, and at one point, the metal will go from solid to liquid. That's a phase, a change of phase from solid to liquid happens at one precise temperature. You can look up on Wikipedia any metal you want. Look it up. Look up on Wikipedia. They'll be happy to tell you exactly the temperature at which that model undergoes a phase change from solid to liquid. As you heat it up, it melts, cool the liquid down, and at that temperature, it will freeze and turn into a solid again. Glass, on the other hand, is amorphous, and in the business, they call glass a supercooled fluid. That means even though glass might look to you to be solid, in fact, all glass is a flowing liquid. The colder the glass, the slower it flows, but it does still flow. As you heat up glass, there is no particular temperature at which it melts because it was always melted. It was always a liquid. It just gets softer and softer and less viscous. But that's just a continual process as it gets hotter and hotter. In any event, on the molecular level, a metal pan, a metal pot on the molecular level has crevices in the surface, which are relatively small because the metal is a crystal lattice. A glass utensil, on the other hand, on the molecular level, has much larger crevices on the surface. If you would look with a microscope at the surface of a glass utensil or the surface of a metal utensil, you'll find that metal utensils have relatively small crevices, and glass utensils relatively large utensils. Of course, it depends upon on how well the crystal has been polished, but there are many factors here. Bottom line, according to the Mishnah and Gemara, glass does not absorb tastes. And since, according to the Mishnah and Gemara, glass does not absorb any taste, there's nothing to be released and therefore requires no kashering at all. According to the Mishnah and Gemara, therefore, you could use the same glass utensils, hot or cold. You can use them for milk and meat, or if you acquire treif, glass utensils from the non-Jew, you can use them for kosher. No kashering is required because there's no absorption of taste. Glass utensils used all year long can be used for Pesach as well, just requires ordinary cleaning. That is the position of the Mishnah and Gemara, and that indeed is the position of the Shulchan Aruch, and the overwhelming majority of Sephardic communities embrace this approach. Ashkenaz communities, on the other hand, are lechatchila strict and hold that since glass is made from sand, and we're back to silicon again, since glass is made from sand, Ashkenaz authorities hold that glass should have the status of kashered, clay utensils, like sand, clay, should all be lumped together, and lechatchila, therefore, just as clay utensils, kashered, cannot be kashered, similarly, glass cannot be kashered. Ashkenaz poskim, therefore, block kashering of glass utensils from treif to kosher, from milk to meat, from chametz to Pessah, whatever the problem might be. But remember that the Ashkenaz position is only lechatchila and not b'diavad. B'diavad, if the Sfaradim are using their glass utensils from all year long for use on Pesach as well, and if you're a fantasy, you can imagine an Ashkenaz Jew being a guest in a Sephardic household on Pesach. If in your fantasy you can imagine such a thing, even the Ashkenaz poskim agree, there's no objection to the Ashkenazi eating the food served on a glass dish or cooked in a glass utensil, which the Sephardim have used without koshering them. B'diavad, the Ashkenazim agree with the Sephardim, but lechatchila, the Ashkenazim are stricter. As far as Pyrex, Duralex, or heat-resistant glass by any other name is concerned, back in the 1950s, 1960s, when these products first came on the market, many rabbis instructed their flocks, Ashkenaz rabbis, instructed their flocks that Pyrex cannot be kashered, and even many Sephardic authorities were strict, holding that Pyrex, Duralex, heat-resistant glass by any other name does not have the leniencies of ordinary glass, as discussed in the Mishnah and Gemara, because of metallic elements which are dissolved in the glass. And the metallic elements change the composition of the glass. That's what makes it stronger, and therefore heat resistant, doesn't crack when you heat it or cool it quickly. Although many earlier poskim, 1950s, 1960s, were strict regarding these utensils, as you get to the end of towards the end of the 20th century, the tide did turn. The reason glass utensils tend to crack when they're heated or cooled too quickly is because of the amorphous composition of the glass. Glass has all kinds of junk dissolved in it, and the dissolved junk in the glass expands and contracts with heating and cooling at a different speed from the glass of the utensil. If the stuff which is dissolved in the glass expands and contracts at a different speed from the glass itself, you're going to end up cracking the utensil. Pyrex, Duralex, heat-resistant glass by any other name is, if anything, more pure than ordinary glass. Purer than ordinary glass. The whole utensil expands and contracts at the same speed as you heat it and cool it. And therefore, by the end of the 20th century, most of the poskim agreed that the Pyrex, Duralex, heat-resistant glass by any other name has the leniencies of glass, according to the Sephardic poskim, and b'diavad has the leniencies of glass, according to the Ashkenaz poskim, because Ashkenaz poskim are lenient only b'diavad. That's glass, and different kinds of glass. Let's go one step further. Tzitz. Bamboo is a cleates. Bamboo is a tree. Anyone who's seen a bamboo tree knows that it's a tree. And therefore, just as any cleates, just as any utensil made out of wood can be kashered, bamboo can be kashered simply by immersion in boiling water. That's true from treif to kosher, equally true from chametz to Pessah. Let's finish up today with the Tzitz Eliezer. Tzitz Eliezer, written by Rav Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, who was for many, many, many years the head of the Bet Din Le'irurim, the top rabbinic bezdin, the top rabbinic Bet Din in the Rabbanut here in Eretz Yisrael. He was for many, many, many years the head of the Moetzet Rabbanut Rashit. He was in charge of the official positions of the chief rabbinate in Israel, immensely influential posek in Eretz Yisrael. And let's see what he has to say about clay, plastica, nylon utensils made out of any synthetic material for Pesach. The first thing he says is it's clear that as far as the Mishnah and Gemara are concerned, anything which is cooked in a kli sheni can be kashered in a kli sheni. The idea is as follows. Any utensil which absorbs taste on the fire with a source of heat can be kashered. The taste can be released only by immersion in boiling water, which is on a source of heat. If, on the other hand, the absorption took place without any source of heat under the utensil, for example, a soup plate into which the hot soup was poured, that's kli sheni. There's no source of heat here. Kli sheni absorbs the taste of the soup or chametz or whatever is going into the bowl, but to kasher it, according to the Mishnah and Gemara, you don't need immersion in boiling water on a source of heat. It's enough to pour boiling water onto the utensil. The rule, according to the Mishnah and Gemara, is kibol o kach polto. However the taste was absorbed, that's the way the taste can be released. And therefore, if it was absorbed in a kli sheni by the hot liquid being poured into the bowl, it can be kashered by pouring boiling water over the bowl. Now, although this position is lechatchila in general rejected by contemporary poskim, and contemporary poskim in general always require immersion in boiling water on a source of heat, this is something we can rely upon if major financial loss is involved. And therefore, plastic utensils, which would be ruined by immersion in boiling water, but can survive having boiling water poured on them, can even be kashered in this manner. In Eretz Yisrael, where the Jewish community was much poorer than in North America back in the middle of the 20th century, the Tzitz Eliezer was happy not only to approve of kashering plastic utensils, but even if the absorption had happened only in the form of kli sheni, the kashering can be done in the form of kli sheni just by pouring boiling water over the utensil. Nowadays, if we're talking about a cheap utensil and there is no major financial loss concerns involved, then this particular leniency would, of course, fall away. But bottom line, we have seen that Rov Minyan and Rov Binyan, the vast majority, the mainstream of poskim, have no difficulty with kashering modern materials, polymers, Teflon, you name it. It all can be kashered by immersion in boiling water in the ordinary way. We're going to pause at this time, and I invite you to continue viewing our shiurim in the Web Yeshiva. Next Monday, I'm going to speak about Leil HaSeder, specifically Motzi Matzah, and we have a wealth of other shiurim which will be available to you regarding Pesach and everything else imaginable. So at this time, I bid you adieu, wish you a good week, and eventually a Shabbat Shalom and a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, and look forward to seeing you all again in the ongoing Web Yeshiva. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
My pleasure.